Dr. Talford also has a show on WCHB AM 1340 that airs on Saturdays at 9:30 in the morning and Mondays at 6:30 in the evening. That's on WCHB AM 1340, Saturdays at 9:30 a.m. and Mondays at 6:30 p.m. And now, without further ado, I present to you that old native Detroiter, the one and only Dr. John Talford.
Thank you, Char J, a.k.a. Charlotte Jones, author of A Ain't Always for Apple. A Ain't Always for Apple, an erotic adult alphabet book. And this is one heck of a book. We got to make sure this book gets appropriate publicity because it's going to sell like hotcakes once that happens. My name is Detroit. I'm a blue-collar town. Blue salt melts my mid-March snow. Speedy cars and sprinters spring from me. I father fierce fighters and funky music. In a Motown moment, I can spit the blues right back in a bureaucrat's eye. Have you never seen blue salt? No complex chemistry here, only the old color of a new sky. And there's a new sky dawning on Detroit today because we have got Professor Peter Hammer in the station today on WJZZ, the John Telford Detroit Show on WJZZ, and we're going to be interviewing him about a real Detroit icon because he has written a biography, co-written a biography of Dr. George Crockett. And we're going to be talking to him right after I make a couple of my usual political commentary, because we've got to win this battle for democracy. We've got to win it. I'm providing ways on this show and on my WCHB show for us to try to do that because we are in trying times right now with these Retrumplicans, who are trying to take over our democracy. And we've got to make sure that does not happen. And we've also got to tell the truth. We've got to tell the truth to our youth, and that's actually a couplet. Tell the truth to our youth, which is what Professor Peter Hammer has always tried to do, and is what I have always tried to do. And having said that, Pete, welcome to the John Telford Detroit Show on WJZZ Internet Television.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about Judge Crockett.
Well, we're going to talk about Judge Crockett, and we're also going to talk about you. I'm kind of surprised you haven't written your autobiography. I just signed mine to you, but you have not written yours. When are you going to write your autobiography?
Well, that's a fair question. I mean, I think it's more fruitful for me to talk about Judge Crockett and Judge Keith, and those are the two biographies that I have participated as a team to write. We do at the Detroit Equity Action Lab, which is one of our major programs at the Keith Center for Civil Rights, use this tool called an ethno-autobiography. So I actually have been thinking of this through the lens of an ethno-autobiography, and that's coming from Lily Mendoza at Oakland University, and Jim Perkinson has been kind of mentoring us about
Jim.
what that is. And it's been a real helpful exercise for me to kind of situate my family story against the backdrop of American history, in particular the impact that we've all had on Native Americans. So I am anticipating trying to write something through that lens that will tell a broader story, not just about myself and the family, but all the different people that have been displaced as we came across the prairies and took advantage of every opportunity that was available for white folks and participated sadly in the displacement and the genocide of our Native peoples.
Absolutely.
So for a better understanding, I'm sorry, John, for a better understanding for me, what is your background? Because he's saying you should write what is your background?
Tell us about yourself, Pete.
Yeah, so I teach at Wayne State Law School. Okay. I've been blessed to direct the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights. So a lot of my current work is all focused on Detroit through the lens of spatial structural racism. So we develop an analysis of what's happening in the city through a lens of spatial structural racism, which one of my mentors, John Powell, is one of John's former students. So there's a nice connection and lineage between the work we're doing at the Keith Center and John Powell is a Detroit hero.
Oh, he's my hero too. I was his teacher. He ended up becoming my mentor. Because John Powell is probably the most brilliant student I have ever taught, bar none. And I've taught some pretty bright young men and women. Again, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so about the first third of my career was really looking at domestic health law and policy. And the second third was really looking at international public health and economic development. And it was interacting with John when I was asked to direct the Keith Center that set of skills applied locally through a lens of spatial structural racism really was a powerful set of tools to be trying to understand what's happening in the city. But before that, I grew up in Spokane, Washington. Okay. So, and I tell people it's wider than Livonia, so coming from a very different background. Went to Catholic schools, Jesuit educated in high school and college. So I graduated from Gonzaga University that people now know about if they care about college basketball, but would have no reason to know about otherwise. And my joke is the first pagan institution I ever went to was the University of Michigan. So went to University of Michigan for law school and for a PhD in economics, practiced law for a while, but always intended to end up teaching. So
didn't you work for University of Michigan?
I worked 8 years at the University of Michigan before being the first male in living memory, the first gay male ever to be considered for tenure, and the only body to be denied tenure by a minority veto. So 8 years there. And
so that was a form of firing then?
Yeah, I mean, basically got fired from my first academic job.
Yeah, well, sometimes getting fired is a badge of honor if you get fired for the wrong reason.
Right. Been there.
I hold the record for getting fired from the Detroit Public Schools community yesterday. I keep coming back, turning up again like a bad penny, but I've been fired several times for raising a little hell that needed to be raised.
If you have to conform to stay, it's better not to be there.
You got that right. Oh, I have to quote you on that. Yeah. If you have to conform to stay, it is better not to be there. So it is better that I wasn't there, but I'm back. You know, I keep turning up. I'm the poet in residence now there, but I was superintendent back in 2012, 2013. Got fired by the emergency financial manager when he became emergency manager. You know, Public Act 436 kicked in. He disempowered the good elected board and immediately fired me. Later said he was wrong. But anyway, I've got some questions that I want to ask you, Pete. Professor Peter Hammer is our guest today from Wayne State University and the Wayne State University Law School. What do Detroiters need to know about the man that you have co-written a biography of, to end a sentence with a preposition, Dr. George Crockett? Yeah.
So first, I'd want to give a shout out to Ed Littlejohn, who's my co-author and is an emeritus professor at Wayne State Law School. And if it wasn't for Ed, this book wouldn't exist. And he started this book in the early 1990s when he was able to actually interview and spend time with Judge Crockett and Ernie Goodman, who was his former law partner.
Goodman, yeah.
And Judge Crockett left his remaining papers to Ed, so we had access to just an amazing set of materials that other researchers would not have. So,
and he's just turning 87.
He's turning 87. He's retired. He's now down in Florida and suffered a few of the recent hurricanes, but still going strong.
Well, he's down where it's warm. So
but I just say, I start every interview just acknowledging the debt that this book owes to Ed before delving into the substance. But
I often wondered if he was related to Alonzo Littlejohn, the great high jumper out of Western Michigan.
Yeah, I don't think so. But Littlejohn's a pretty common
fairly common name
in the African American community.
It is.
It's not. I wouldn't say it's present, right? It's like perennial in many different places. So it's easy to find Littlejohns in many different places, even though it's not Smith or Jones or or many others. But George Crockett is really a giant. And if you're thinking about democracy today and Detroit today, you know, we've been generations without having giants in terms of political leaders and judges in many respects. So I think it's incredibly important, particularly for young people, to hear that voice, because it's not a voice that we hear. Eddie Glaude, who's at Princeton and wrote one of his books is Democracy in Black. And he has a wonderful chapter where he talks about black liberalism. And he talks about from the 1950s onward, and it tracks a lot of what Crockett was doing in terms of McCarthyism and everything, that the political space in America generally, but also in black politics, has so narrowed that we have blinders on.
Didn't Crockett defend Coleman Young.
Yeah, no. So there's a huge part of Crockett's story. Sorry, every decade you find something significant that Crockett did. But in the 1950s, he was on the front line domestically, right, or Detroit and nationally, in defense of people's rights under the attack of McCarthyism. So one of the people he defended in 1952 was a young Coleman Young, who was then a labor activist.
Yeah, I knew him. I knew him when he was a state senator.
Yep.
As a matter of fact, he. Coleman Young followed my track career and the track career of the Wayne State track team, the relay team that was beating Michigan and Michigan State in those days.
Yeah.
He was a real aficionado of our track program, and Cliff Hatcher and Bullet Billy Smith and all those guys who were running with me, Pete Petros. Anyway, I'm digressing, as I always do. I got to get
fine.
used to my
That's
digressions.
Fine. But the point is that we don't have voices that go for a broad political spectrum. And Crockett was of an era thinking about economic justice in ways that are far more progressive and substantial than we do today, thinking about racial justice. So as we're struggling today about economic justice, about racial justice, we need to hear some of these voices from the past.
Too bad we couldn't have got him to defend my Uncle Frank Telford. He got blacklisted at that same time. He was a producer, director, my father's younger brother. But those were bad times that seem to be arising again with this Trumpism.
It's ideology. So the minute that you go beyond truth-based democracy and what political scientists will call a public sphere, where we have common senses of what facts are, what trends are, the minute you move to ideology, all bets are off, right?
That's
and
right.
then every kind of persecution and oppression becomes justifiable. And certainly McCarthyism is a nice counterpoint to be thinking about as we're dealing with the residue of Trumpism.
Well, McCarthyism was akin to Trumpism, which is akin to Nazism.
Yeah.
A lot of these bad isms that we're dealing with now, very scary.
Yeah, and it can happen on the right or the left. The ideological, the logic of fascism is a generalized logic that people can exploit regardless of whether they're left or right.
That's right, and thank God we this fella in Georgia didn't get elected. I mean, everyone was really worried that the football player, the track man,
because
totally
people
ignoramus.
They vote for celebrities. They don't know anything about this person's politics. Luckily, this guy came off as an idiot, so that was pretty obvious to everybody. But it's a celebrity. Let's vote for him. That's not how you're supposed to do it.
But it's also we're moving into tribalism. Right, that if you're on the Republican tribe or the Democratic tribe, it really doesn't matter who the opponent is; they're the enemy, and it really doesn't matter then how weak your candidate is.
That's
so
right.
I think we've had just a small pause, and we shouldn't get fooled that that it's over. We've had a small pause in the midterms, where we have a little bit of reflection to say we don't want to go down that road, or at least enough of a center has said that. That we have time, I think, to regroup. But the fight for democracy, as you said in your introduction, is ever present and probably more serious now than any time it's been in any of our recent memories.
I have never seen anything like it in my 87 years on this planet.
Yeah.
Whoever would have thought that you would have a Congress that is made up of over 100 individuals who are turning their back on the Constitution of the United States, and a former president who has actually said we need to do away with the Constitution of the United States. Those words came out of his mouth.
Yeah.
The 14th Amendment, the 13th Amendment, the whole 9 yards. He wants to do away with it.
Yeah. No, and these are desperate times. But that's again where Crockett his whole life, and for an African American man, it's kind of a little bit of a paradox. He believed in the rule of law. Right? He actually believed, and even though he knew that the law often never did anything for him, he believed in the potential. And he has some pretty powerful passages where he really says the law will only be able to reach its full potential in America when implemented by black judges. Right?
Wow.
And has a really well-developed sort of theory historically on why the latent power of equality can only be unlocked by people who have been oppressed.
Yes, yes.
And so he was able to fight for the rule of law and trying to make that progress happen, even at the same time he grew up in Jim Crow South of Florida, and even though he faced oppression in multiple ways throughout his career, where the law failed him. So again, that kind of paradox of believing in the rule of law, even though the law was frequently failing him in his own life.
So how did that growing up in Jim Crow in Florida mold the man? How did that?
Yeah, and you think about Crockett, you think about his family.
Okay.
Right? You think about his family, you think about the black community. And while segregation is awful and evil, it created support systems, right? So he was able to be nurtured by a very loving and sophisticated and principled black community that he carried that with him the rest of his life. Part of that is moving from Jacksonville, and he was born in 1909, kind of get our mindset back.
Yeah.
Reconstruction was in living memory, right? So growing up in Jacksonville, it was the living memory that you did have successful black politicians. You did have successful black, and I think it's underappreciated, and this is an intuition, and I haven't seen it talked about a lot elsewhere, that generation was actually gifted in a way that the next generation was not.
My listeners aren't all that sophisticated. Talk a bit about what Reconstruction was.
Yeah, so you have the end of the Civil War, right? And you had a period where federal troops were occupying the southern states and were actually enforcing the recently enacted post-Civil War amendments. The 13th Amendment, which is abolishing slavery. The 14th Amendment, that is giving you equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment, which is a right to vote. Those were actually live rights.
That Trump wants to get rid of now, by the way.
Yeah,
Let's not forget that.
There is this whole call to get rid of the protections of the 14th Amendment, the birthright citizenship, all of these protections. And this is something that John Powell and others talk about. We really have two constitutions. Right, and they're at war with each other. Right, the sort of the original Constitution that had the fifth clause had all sorts of disenfranchisement, and the post-Civil War Constitution, which is really trying to extend these rights universally. And so there's interesting tension between the post-Civil War amendments, right, and the original Constitution, and those that want to favor kind of the Make America Great Again. Really want to kind of annul.
To me, it's like it's a white constitution and a black constitution. And I think that's kind of what you're alluding to without actually saying that.
Yeah.
Okay. That's
no, and Judge Crockett would say it just like that.
Oh yeah, he would. I never had the honor of meeting him.
Yeah. Would you mind if I just read one quote? Because again,
by,
I think one
by
of
all
the
means, this
Let
is
me
your
do
show.
this first.
Excellent.
You're watching the Dr. John Talford Detroit Show, live streaming on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter, and other top social media platforms. Like us, follow us, share us, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching WJZZ Cool TV, the coolest station in the world.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm gonna do a little couplet. If you wish your life never to sit on the shelf, you had better endeavor to write it yourself. So that is why I want to see Professor Peter Hammer seriously consider doing his own autobiography, because I think that that's something that everyone needs to see and to be aware of. You should not underestimate yourself. You're an icon in your own right in this city, and that needs to be known. And I would like to see you do one of these right here.
I will take that as serious counsel from a man I respect. So
I'll keep pushing you.
I will advise that. But one of the things we did, and this was Ed's sort of editorial choice that was brilliant. The book has extended quotations from Crockett. So you don't just hear about him, you hear from him. So you really get to know his voice. But the book is called No Equal Justice, The Civil Rights Legacy of Civil Rights Icon George W. Crockett. And the No Equal Justice comes from the following quote from Judge Crockett.
Is that Wayne State University Press?
This is Wayne State University Press.
Okay, so that's how people can get the book.
Right, and I always tell people buy through local bookstores, right?
Okay.
So you can get it at Source Books and Pages and,
Source.
and other local bookstores. And if you're desperate, you can go to Amazon. But, I think it's important
That's
to
how I
support
sell most of mine
the
on
local
Amazon.
economy.
No.
But the language no equal justice comes from this quote. He says, "There is no equal justice for black people today. There never has been. To our everlasting shame, the quality of justice in America has always been and is now directly related to the color of one's skin as well as the size of one's pocketbook." So this is unvarnished. You're not going to hear euphemisms. Judge Crockett calls out the injustice as he experienced it, which was always racialized.
When did he say that and write that?
That was from an article called "The Black Judge Speaks" from a publication called Judicature in 1968. So he was elected to Recorder's Court in 1966. So this is kind of early as he is assuming his role as judge and acknowledging the injustice, as I said, that had been experienced by himself and black folks since the way before there was in America. And then using his authority to try to use the law to correct injustice.
He could have written it today.
No, and that's why it's important for kids today and Detroiters today, because what he is talking about, even if it might be from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, still applies in a way that is authentically truthful, in a way that we don't hear politicians talk about, in a way that, until you really get to the Black Lives Matter movement, in a way that is actually reaching at the soul level of people's experience and envisioning what justice really looks like. And so this is kind of like going and hearing from an elder, and we need our elders, and skipping about 3 generations of leadership that hasn't been talking like that, to rediscover these gems and these real heroes that should be helping guide us today.
That's why we... and I'm so glad that you're going to come and talk to my kids at Frederick Douglass. I mean, they need to hear you, and they need to hear about Judge Crockett. Yeah. They need to know their history. I mean, he is history of the first water. Everyone has to know everything there is to know about Judge Crockett. Yeah. And I want to ask you this: how did Judge Crockett end up at the United States Department of Labor? In the New Deal administration? That was President Roosevelt, the New Deal administration. He ended up there. How did that come about? That was a real achievement on his part.
Huge. I mean, just imagine a black kid growing up in Jacksonville, Florida.
Right.
And again, sort of that black support system. He's a Morehouse man. So he went to Morehouse College, and anybody who knows Morehouse men know that defines them for the rest of their lives, and it certainly did Judge Crockett. And he had this incredible self-confidence, right, and ambition, and I say that in a very healthy way. He graduates from Morehouse. He wants to go to Harvard, right, and he finds out it's expensive, right, and his family didn't have the money to go to Harvard. But he read about the University of Michigan that it had a recent benefactor who has a pretty nasty legacy himself, William Cook, but it made the University of Michigan what it is today, but it also made it at that time accessible in terms of funding. Right, so he applies to the University of Michigan, is admitted to the University of Michigan. He gets support from an aunt. So you have these, again, extended black families that are enabling opportunity. So the support, he's working full-time, and the admissions office says you can't do that, law school's so serious, but he's got to do that, because if he doesn't work full-time, he's not going to have the money to pay tuition. Right. He gets help from his aunt. So again, you're sort of seeing the supportive black community, and he becomes the only African-American to graduate in his class in 1934. Right, so you can sort of imagine that confidence, that ability, that ambition. And he goes to Florida to take the bar, and there's no way they're going to let a black man, because the bar was given in the state Senate chambers, right? Yeah. So these bar applicants would sit in the desks of state senators. They weren't going to let a black man sit in those desks, so they made him take the bar sitting in a table outside of the doorway, right, in the hall. So you get these, but then he talks about why he didn't fight that, right? Because you got to choose your battles, right? I need admission to the bar. That gives me. So he knows it's unjust, right? He knows that's wrong, but he's going to select the battles that he's going to choose. He
takes it for the greater good.
Passes the bar, right? Then says, I can't stand Florida, right? I can't live here. So moves his family to West Virginia, which is about as far north as you can go and still be in the South. Yeah. And then consciously switches from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party and supports the West Virginia Democratic Senate candidate in 1938. Right, and the patronage of that decision, which he then campaigned for the man, was to get a job at the U.S. Department of Labor. So he became the very first black lawyer to be at the Department of Labor, and rose up in those ranks because he's just that good until he reaches a glass ceiling where he's told he's not going to get promoted anymore. Because if he were promoted to the next level, he'd be supervising white lawyers. And they're not going to let a black lawyer supervise white lawyers. So he jumps ship. He says, okay, I'm not staying there then. Yeah, and he becomes the first hearing officer for the Fair Employment Practices Act, which was a sort of a very progressive commission at the time during World War II to start making sure that there wasn't discrimination in federal contractors. And that connection kind of got him to working in Detroit when there was a streetcar union strike. And at that point, he met R.J. Thomas, who was the head of the
was
UAW.
that?
So
When was that strike?
that strike would have been 42, 43.
Okay, it was during World War II.
During World War
I know
II.
that.
Yeah.
Because I remember it. You know?
okay.
I mean, I'm an old guy.
And Crockett stopped the strike,
Yeah.
right, using the federal law. But he also at that time met A.J. Thomas, who was the head of the UAW, right? So he gets to know the UAW folks. He's offered a job in the UAW to fight discrimination within the union.
Mm-hmm.
So he's given a very important job inside the UAW, and then moves to Detroit, and that's where his family relocates. And he's a Detroiter from 1943, right after the riot, which a race riot, a real race riot.
Well, I remember it very well. My old man, was a former pro boxer, and he saved an old black man from getting stomped to death over on Stanton Street. I was 7 years old, and kept him overnight and drove him home the next day. A real old man. Matter of fact, he had been born in slavery. He was that old.
Oh, wow.
He was a little teeny guy. I can remember. I had a chance to talk to him when I was just a little kid. He was only about 119 pounds. A little skinny old man in his 90s, and he was already down on the pavement. And these guys were kicking him. These toughs, and they knew my father was a boxer. They backed off. My father picked the guy up, carried him home, but you know what? And I'm digressing again, but that old man, he lived over on Wabash, and within 2 weeks he died.
Mm.
And I would have to say that was a casualty of that riot.
Yeah.
Even though he never got counted, but he was a casualty of that riot because he was kicked in his insides, and I think that he did not survive for that reason. But again, I've been digressing, but. But why did Ruther purge Judge Crockett and Sugar and Goodman from the UAW? What was that all about?
Yeah, so this is again this sort of remember I said each decade. So the 1930s he's doing something. 1940s he's doing
say
something.
who Sugar was, by the way.
I was just finna say
Love that.
Who are
So
they?
Marie Sugar. People
Marie.
here know the Sugar Law Center.
Right. Yeah.
This is named after Marie Sugar.
Marie
So
Sugar.
sort of see the ongoing legacy today.
Mm-hmm.
And then Ernie Goodman. I'd say that the three best lawyers of the last century were
Really?
Marie Sugar, Ernie Goodman, and George Crockett, right? Coming out of Detroit, and they all came out of the UAW, but they were on the progressive side of the UAW in the early 1940s, and there was huge conflict inside the UAW, as you probably know,
As there is right now today.
yeah. So Walter Reuther, who was on the very conservative side, was on the side really saying that the union should be a partner with the corporate entities, with the corporations, and not be this antagonist, and shouldn't be asking fundamental questions about economic justice in the country through the lens of the union. His rise to power led to the purging of anybody on the progressive side. And so Crockett got thrown out, Marie Sugar got thrown out, Ernie Goodman got thrown out, and then they faced a boycott. The UAW
That's not a very complimentary part of Reuther's history.
Yeah,
Right.
and people need to know this. There's
Yeah,
actually
they do.
There's a sub-story that really kind of shows
Yeah.
Crockett's principle. So
My father was a bodyguard of his, by the way, until he got fired for drinking. But this is something that I did not know about Walter Reuther.
Yeah, let me tell you just one other twist on Reuther that's in the
Okay.
book. All the contracts are negotiated at the same time, right? They sort of get the model contract. And it was incredibly important for the progressive side of the UAW, and Crockett in particular, who was charged with ending discrimination or fighting discrimination in the union, that those contracts have a non-discrimination clause, right? And they got it with Ford, they got it with Chrysler. Reuther was the representative dealing with the union for GM. Right, and Reuther promised Crockett, who was there in a position higher than Reuther, right, at that time, that he would have that clause in the contract, and then Reuther broke his word, right? And
I find that disappointing. Reuther was one of my heroes
Yeah.
until you just shared some of this with me.
Life is complicated,
Yeah,
and we
I
have to
know.
learn the complications. But that really ended the relationship between Reuther and Crockett, because Crockett was always a man of his word, right? And to represent that you're going to do this, and then to not do your word, was enough to break that bond, right? So
Yeah,
those
man.
three amazing lawyers get thrown out, and Ruther goes on to redefine the UAW in ways that are substantially different than the folks in the sit-down strike. So Maurice Sugar was the lawyer for the UAW during the sit-down strikes. You kind of see that long, sort of more radical history from the 30s now being purged from the 40s, and then the McCarthy era even more seriously in the 1950s.
Talk a little bit about Crockett's defense of Coleman Young.
Yeah. So these great stories and those great photos. One of the things that the press was generous to us is we have 60 illustrations. So
Wow.
Amazing kind of richness. So you not
Yeah.
just hear the words, but you're able to kind of go through and see that, including some political cartoons, including some other things that are not photos, but document this history. But again, back to McCarthyism. So again, great things in the 30s, great things in the 40s, great things in the 50s, that no other lawyer, other than, and the firm, so back to Ernie Goodman, Goodman and Crockett formed the first integrated law firm in the country, coming out of
Wow.
Detroit. Starts in 1951, Goodman, Crockett, Eden, and Robb. And even though Crockett was not the second senior, it was important to the firm that he become the second named partner to illustrate the importance of their commitment to integration, right? So they were the only lawyers in Detroit in that period who would represent people alleged to be communist, right? So when
Well, my aunt was a communist. My aunt Letty was one of the founders of the Detroit Federation of Teachers, and she was a card-carrying
Yeah.
communist, Letty Telford.
and that was not unexceptional, right?
Yeah,
This was
yeah.
before we had that narrowing of politics, where you now if you say of things and you're called a communist, you're a pariah, right? Or a socialist, and these sort of epithets come back to chill and prevent people from thinking outside of that narrow box of liberalism.
She was a friend and disciple of Saul Alinsky
Okay.
in Chicago. In fact, I have a book that he signed that belonged to her.
Yeah, and as you know, that Saul Alinsky inspired all sorts of, and still inspires all sorts of activists thinking and tactics today, right? That you don't get social change if you're not willing to look broadly in terms of your inspirations.
Trying to remember the title of that book. It'll come back to me, but
Yeah.
that was his.
Yeah, so Coleman Young is being brought up in front of the House Un-Americans Activity
Right,
Committee. The Goodman firm is the only firm in town that's going to represent anybody alleged to be a communist.
Yeah.
And so George Crockett is sitting
Which
there.
Coleman Young wasn't, by the way.
No, these are complicated. People have
Yeah.
liberal
Yeah.
politics, or thinking about economic
I
justice.
mean, he believed in
different ways.
socialism as we all do,
Yeah.
or should, and I have to be careful, how I say that. People
Yeah.
calling me a socialist, I guess I am. I mean, but so is Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
You're watching WJZZ
Yeah.
Cool TV, live streaming on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter, and other top social media platforms. Like, follow, share, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching WJZZ Cool TV, the coolest station in the world.
And lest I forget, Miss Virginia Starkey, fondly known simply as V, the proprietress of V's Boutique, offers a wide range of fine clothing and accessories for ladies. You can find all sizes of women's fine apparel in V's one-stop, excellent customer service at V's Boutique that you can't find anywhere else in Detroit anymore. V's is at 16423 East Warren Avenue. 16423 East Warren Avenue, right around the corner from the Alger Theater and right around the corner from one of the few libraries that is still open in Detroit. Make an appointment by calling V, that's Miss Virginia Starkey, known as V, Miss Virginia Starkey, at 248-662-6622. That's 248-662-6622. And we are interviewing Professor Peter Hammer on the John Telford Detroit Show this morning, and he has been expounding on the trial that Crockett's law firm represented him in at the House Un-American Activities hearings which my uncle Frank also was subjected to, when he was a Hollywood producer director. So talk a little bit about how that transpired, Dr. Hammer.
This is high drama, right? So
Yes,
in
it
the book
is.
you get the kind of blow by blow. I mean, from Crockett trying to make an opening statement, and that's not permitted, and wasn't permitted generally. But Crockett's not going to be there and just be a houseplant. He's going to be active in that. So he's himself being sort of chastised from the committee.
So wonder they didn't go after him.
Well, there's another backstory when he represented the leaders of the Communist Party when nobody else would in the United States versus Dennis. The judge at the end of the trial sentenced all the defense lawyers to criminal contempt. So Crockett actually faced criminal charges for doing his job as a defense lawyer. And again,
Incredible.
that principled courage. He's going to do what's right, and he's going to choose his fights, but he's going to do stuff that he knows is right, even though it's going to have serious personal consequences. But back to Coleman Young.
Yes.
There's this fight over exhibits. You actually have the sort of Crockett wanting to see the exhibit before they do it, and the sort of the prosecutor, and then we're sort of physically getting active to make sure that he can see what he's going to be questioned on. But the brilliance of Coleman Young comes out in the story as well. And the testimony was actually pressed into a vinyl album and sold on the streets of Detroit because what Coleman Young did was turn the tables. And he made the U.S. congressmen look like fools, right? And they had that brilliance of Coleman Young.
I remember his quote, "You must have taken me for a stool pigeon." That's what what Coleman said.
No, so this is part of Detroit's lore, right?
Right.
And the history of Coleman Young. But sitting right next to Coleman Young in the pictures in the book, which I love, is George Crockett. Right, and you kind of see that, and that their relationship went, for decades onward. The last picture in the book is actually an older Coleman Young and an older Crockett, just kind of in repose next to each other, in the sort of very thoughtful-looking sort of notion to sort of close that tale of the wonderful relationship that those two had, even though radically different men, right, just different temperaments, right, different of career trajectories, but aligned in terms of what their vision was for Detroit and for justice.
I mentioned that Coleman was a supporter of Detroit athletes, Detroit African-American athletes. I was one of the few, non-African American athletes that he did support. But he also supported Charlie Primus. Charlie Primus, I don't know if you're aware, Charlie Primus was an All-American basketball player at Wayne State University. He was about a year ahead of me at Wayne State. But he's been my lifelong friend. Well, he's passed now. We've lost Charlie Primus. But in fact, I think he was going to give Coleman Young was going to give him the key to the city. When Charlie made All-American. Charlie was on those great teams that played in the early 1950s that also featured Ernie Wagner and John Klein. The great triple jumper. They called him Jumping Johnny Klein. And now this is Wayne State history, and you're a Wayne State professor now.
I got to learn it.
So you got to know about the All-Americans who came out of Wayne State. You're talking to one right now. I'm on the NCAA.
Understand that.
I was NCAA All-American at Wayne State. But Charlie Primus was a very, very probably the best basketball player ever to come out of Wayne State University. Also played for the Harlem Globetrotters. But let's get back to talk a little bit more about that trial that Coleman Young. And how he was able to get Coleman off the hook.
Yeah, I wouldn't say off the hook. I mean, because everybody suffered. Coleman Young may have turned the table in the hearing, right? But the power structure is still there, right? So Coleman Young suffered by being brought in front of it. Your father, I'm sure, suffered. David Marinus,
It was my uncle Frank.
Okay.
He got blacklisted.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't work for a while.
Yeah, David Marinus, who's the Pulitzer Prize-winning author. His father was before the committee, and Crockett defended his father. So when Marinus writes about Detroit, he writes very...
Whose father?
David Marinus, the Washington Post columnist and Pulitzer Prize winner.
Okay, I'm not familiar with him.
Yeah. But so when he writes about Detroit, he writes very sympathetically about Crockett because he was a family hero for the Marinus family. Because again, he would represent his father when nobody else would.
Right.
And it didn't... Sadly, these are not trials that are fair. The lawyer can't even talk, as I was saying, right? So the whole power structure is there, and people were damaged. People's careers were ended, and people were harmed. And Crockett might have been there trying to do his best to represent him, but that harm was a legacy that many people suffered just by being called in front of those hearings.
That's right. Actually, my uncle wasn't a communist. If anything, he was a capitalist, but
Doesn't matter.
Right.
no, it didn't matter. It did not matter. Just because of some of his affiliations, and he suffered. And I have a real fear that we're going in that direction again in this country. I mean, it is very, very scary. Yeah. And just because, Biden defeated Trump, which Trump himself is denying.
No, he didn't.
That's why we need to read these histories. Right?
That's right.
Because we've been there. And United States versus Dennis, which was the charging the leaders of the Communist Party for criminal acts under the Smith Act, not for what they did, but for what they thought, was generally viewed.
The thought police.
It was generally viewed as the low point of First Amendment jurisprudence.
Yeah, George Orwell lives.
Yeah,
I mean, this is where
that could easily come back. It's based on fear and hysteria. And when politics, back to this notion of fascism, is based upon fear, hysteria, and othering, these are the dynamics that lead to these kind of political of oppression and purges.
You just used a John Paul phrase.
Othering and belonging.
Yeah, that's what he's in charge of at the University of California at Berkeley.
Yeah, the Institute of Othering and Belonging. And if people haven't seen John Powell, Google him and Google the Institute, and you'll find some of the best thinking in the country about race, about democracy, about an equitable future for all of us. And we need that kind of teaching, just as we need to learn from our history from people like George Crockett.
Right.
John Powell was the brightest student I ever taught, bar none. Okay. What was Crockett's role defending leaders of the United States Communist Party in that U.S. versus Dennis case? Talk about some specifics regarding that case.
Yeah, so as I said, the entire top leadership was arrested. Right? It's the same thing of arresting everybody on the Republican National Committee or everybody on the Green Party, if you want kind of an example of people who are not part of the mainstream. It's like arresting the entire leadership and putting them on criminal trial. Right, and it was important to the Communist Party that they have an integrated defense team, right? Because the Communist Party was an advocate for civil rights and was making stands in Scarborough and other places that nobody else would, right? So they wanted an integrated team. They actually had Charles Hamilton Houston, which is going into the weeds for black lawyers, was one of the leading architects, was the mentor to Thurgood Marshall, was on the team before, and he leaves, right?
Wow.
And Maurice Sugar, who is part of the advising the council, calls Crockett. So there's a wonderful story where Crockett's actually painting his living room on a ladder, and gets the call from Maurice Sugar saying, "We want you to join the team," right? And he goes through this sort of a very thoughtful sort of analysis, knowing that the principle requires it, right? Because this is the First Amendment, and everybody's First Amendment rights need to be done, but he's just going to take a huge hit, right, in terms of his profession. And his wife, who was a doctor, is trying to start a practice, right? A black doctor in Detroit whose husband is representing communists. The whole family's going to take a hit, but he does it because he thinks it's right, right? So he goes there, defends them. Nobody had any foolish thoughts that they weren't going to be convicted, right? But they should be defended. So they're convicted, and then the judge calls up the defense team and says, "I have some unfinished business." And then summarily, without any due process, sentences all of the defense team to criminal contempt, facing prison charges for aggressively defending their clients. Right?
Wow.
And the conviction is upheld in the Supreme Court, right, which I said is the low point of First Amendment jurisprudence. The contempt conviction is upheld, so Crockett ultimately spends 4 months in jail for representing him. Then has to come back to Detroit and
Crockett spent 4 months in jail.
4 months in prison, federal prison for representing those clients.
Were any of those charges ever overturned?
No. But the law changed, right? Really fairly quickly, the First Amendment gets restored, right? And this is viewed as a real atrocity in terms of justice. And due process is then brought into the contempt proceeding. So the law changes as a result of these things, but it didn't save the defendants in Dennis. It didn't save Crockett or the defense team from actually facing real prison time.
Who was Dennis again?
Eugene Dennis was the sort of second in command of the Communist Party.
Yes.
Right. So he was one of the lead defendants. So the United States
The
versus Dennis,
American Communist Party.
the American
Yeah.
Communist Party. Yeah.
Okay, this book, No Equal Justice, The Legacy of Civil Rights Icon George W. Crockett Jr., is co-authored by Edward J. Littlejohn and Peter J. Hammer, whom we are interviewing today on the John Telford Detroit Show on WJZZ Internet Television. And George Crockett is an inspiration for freedom fighters everywhere. This man is a Detroit icon that everyone, not just African Americans, but every American needs to know the story of George Crockett, Judge George Crockett.
Yeah.
And talk now a little bit about his judgeship and about how he became a judge in Detroit.
I just want to give a shout out. That quote
Yeah.
you said that George Crockett is an inspiration for freedom fighters everywhere is from Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh,
so kind
okay.
of, you know, the people who know, right?
Okay, well, I was going to try to steal the comment.
No, it's great. No,
but
it's great.
I'm in good company with Rashida.
No,
you know.
absolutely. But just it
Who,
shows.
by the way, is one of my books.
As how relevant he is, right? I was saying
Yeah.
that these are things that anybody who cares about justice today needs to know. But to your point, he decides he's going to run for judge, right?
Yep.
And this is back when we had Recorder's Court, right?
Right,
and,
right.
And everybody should learn about Recorder's Court because it was significant. Recorder's Court was the criminal court for the city of Detroit. Right, so the judges were elected based upon the citizens of Detroit. The jury came from the citizens of Detroit, so it had a much better chance of having a black judge over time and having black jurors. Right, actually facing a jury of your peers.
Okay.
And then they abolished it, so we don't have Recorder's Court anymore. And elections are at the county level, juries at the county level. So that notion of access to justice becomes something significant. But
That was deliberate.
no, it is, right? And people, that's why people need to know the history. So one criminal reform that we should be demanding is a return to Recorder's Court, right? To go back to that template, to have greater Detroit control over the criminal justice system.
How can we go about setting up an activist movement to make that happen?
Yeah, I would put it in the broader constellation of criminal justice reform or the abolition movement, and I would make that one of the talking points. Although, again, in the abolitionist movement, you know, they very much focus on not supporting the system as well. So they might say this is propping it up by making it, you know, a little more palatable. So you got to sort of think through some of the implications.
You know, the old saying is think globally but act locally.
Yeah.
And this is something that we've done too little I believe, in Detroit in recent years.
Yeah.
Given the fact that right now our kids can't read in the Detroit Public Schools Community District, and that's been a fight that I've been fighting. And I'm probably going to be initiating you and recruiting you in that fight before we're done.
You're watching WJZZ Cool TV, live streaming on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter, and other top social media platforms. Like, follow, share, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching WJZZ Cool TV, the coolest station in the world. Yeah, they come up quick, don't they, John?
They do come up quick, and I wouldn't catch them if you didn't. If you did, so
But I didn't answer your question. So
Go ahead.
I do think go back to 1966, right?
Yeah.
Crockett's going to run for Recorder's Court judge.
Yeah.
We've identified two of his
the year before the rebellion.
You're right, and he's going to be appointed. He's going to assume judgeship January 1st of '67. Right, so when we talk about the rebellion, just imagine a judge who's 6 months, right, into his first term is going to do what Judge Crockett did. But remember, we've already identified two of his enemies. Right, one of his enemies is Walter Reuther, right, in the UAW.
It's a damn shame,
Yeah.
man. I'm learning something today I
Yeah.
did not know.
The second enemy is J. Edgar Hoover, right?
Oh, we
Because
always
J.
knew
Edgar
about
Hoover
that dude.
is
Yeah.
not going to let a black lawyer who represented the Communist Party be elected judge. So you actually have memos from Hoover trying to undermine Crockett's prospect in 1966, running for this localism Detroit judge, and the UAW initially endorsed him, and then they took his endorsement away. Right, so Reuther and the UAW is coming out against him. We've got great flyers in the book. There's this hammer and sickles, and then Judge Crockett's name, and then why you should not elect Judge Crockett, and all this sort of anti-communist screed coming out. But the black community knew the judge, right? And it was the black community at that neighborhood level, for the trust that he had built with them, and in defiance of the UAW, which was then highly racialized. We're not going to let the white labor union tell us who to elect in terms of our black judges. They came out and supported Judge Crockett. So he wins despite these sort of two large political forces coming out against him,
Right.
and becomes a judge on January 1st, 1967, 6 months before the Detroit Rebellion.
And the black people need to realize that that voice that they had then, they still have it now, and they need to utilize it. They can make all the change in the world if they just come together.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there are too many silos. You know, we've got the National Action Network over here, and by any means necessary, BAM over here, the ACLU Michigan chapter over here, you know, and we need to bring them together to deal with some local problems that are of the first water, in my view.
Yeah.
I mean, whoever heard of a school district that is not teaching its students to read, knowingly not doing it, and continuing not to do it. And we've just reelected incumbents who spent $1 million getting elected onto that board. And it's going to be 4 more years to do nothing unless we get some organization going that'll put a little pressure on them. But we're talking about the history of George W. Crockett. Lord knows we need many more George W. Crockett's today in this city. I'm not saying we don't have some activists. We do, you know, but we need icons. We need giants like George W. Crockett. Okay, let's talk about the little-known role that the National Lawyers Guild in Detroit played in providing legal support to the civil rights movement in the South.
Yeah. So remember, every decade. So we talked about the 50s, go to the 60s. Then George Crockett gets involved in the civil rights movement. Right? And the entire National Lawyers Guild, which has one of the strongest chapters is in Detroit, does that. And Ernie Goodman and George Crockett are elected president and vice president.
When was this?
This would have been 1962 to 1965, so right
Okay.
before he
Okay,
starts
before
to become a judge.
Yeah.
And there weren't lawyers in the South willing to represent civil rights workers.
Yeah,
right?
they were
So
scared for one
if
thing.
you were arrested and you go to jail, there's nobody there to get you out. There's nobody there to get your bond. And you know they were using the jails really as mechanisms of torture and oppression.
Yeah, remember King,
Yeah.
Birmingham jail, the whole.
Yeah, but people would be and Fannie Lou Hamer, the story of her in prison, and where she was beat, right, for doing civil rights work. And so if you're in that jail for any time period, you are incredibly vulnerable, right? And you don't have lawyers there to help you. So what the National Lawyers Guild did is set up a network of their lawyers across the country, and recruited lawyers to go down south. So a lot of the legal work facilitated through the National Lawyers Guild of doing the frontline legal of aid necessary work was being done out of Detroit. So you imagine the Guardian building, and you imagine up on whatever floor George Crockett was on, is part of the national strategy team that is helping guide different parts of the civil rights work. And one of the most important things that they could do is get people on bail, right? And if you get it on bail, and then you got to fight and you got to try to get it out of state court to federal court. So there's all sorts of other legal machinations they're doing. But the most important life-saving thing that they were doing is getting those civil rights workers out of jail and putting them on bail.
Legal support to the civil rights movement in the South. Okay. What role, I think I know the answer to this, but what role did the FBI and the UAW play trying to keep Judge Crockett off of Recorder's Court in the year 1966, which was
talked
the year
a little
just...
bit that they really were out with knives, that they didn't want him on the bench, and they did everything they could to stop him, but they weren't successful. And probably the two most important things Judge Crockett did happen in 67 and 69. And in 67, with the rebellion, he had these mass arrests, right?
Yeah.
And
didn't he have a lot of them they're out on Belle Isle?
Yeah, they were actually being held
I remember
in
that.
the zoo cages in Belle Isle.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And the prosecutor was telling the judges, right? I'm going to say that again because that should just sound completely wrong. The prosecutor was telling the judges to impose bail, and see again how important bail is, of $10,000. So they do these
Which they
mass
couldn't afford.
arrests.
Couldn't afford.
Right? Nobody could afford.
Right.
Was basically saying you're not going to let any of these people under mass arrest, even those that are out there on Belle Isle, out of jail. Right? Judge Crockett not going to stand for that. So
Yeah.
Judge Crockett set up a network with his former law partner, Claudia Markman, who also became an important judge and leading figure in Detroit, with Neighborhood Legal Services, so they could do individualized assessments of risk, which is what you're supposed to do, not collective sort of judgments.
They
of
jump
guilt.
bail in that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to interrupt you.
Gotcha.
I need you to sum up the book, where you get the book, and what's happening on Friday. Sum it up for us.
Love
Yes.
it. So, book title again, No Equal Justice, The Legacy of Civil Rights Icon George W. Crockett Jr. You can get it at Wayne State Press. You can get it at any of your local bookstores, which you should. You can get it at Amazon or any of the sort of standard distribution centers as well. On Friday, in partnership with Detroit IPTV, and we're really grateful to Tim Moore, who's another hero in Detroit in terms of getting people
He's
information.
one of my heroes. He was also my best half miler in the early 1960s. I was his track coach at Southeastern High School.
Let him finish, John.
But
Come on.
it's 6:30. If you come to Wayne State Law School, Partridge Auditorium, 6:30.
What day?
On Friday, this Friday, December 9th,
Yeah.
6:30, Partridge Auditorium, Wayne State Law School. We're going to have a book event. So we're going to have another chance to kind of go through the story.
Sorry. Nope, wrong. Go ahead. Keep
Yeah.
talking.
No, so great prelude, and we thank you for letting us talk to your listeners on Wednesday so they can know that on Friday, if they're interested, if this makes any sense to them, if they want to learn more, they can come to the law school and have another discussion of this in a book signing where we'll make the book available.
And I advertise it Saturday, too, on WCHB. So
Appreciate it,
hopefully
John.
you'll have good attendance at that affair, because everyone needs to go to this affair.
What do you have? You got a minute.
What do I have? Oh, well.
Have it. 30 seconds. I'll give you 30 seconds.
You give me 30 seconds? Okay. Okay. Uncivil Warfare, a poem that I wrote on January the 6th, 2021, which, as you know...
Come on.
Okay, on this evil and failed occasion of the Capitol building invasion,
Have to wait a minute.
the traitor Trump's collusion demands his execution. God yet hasn't pushed the lever on the traitor Trump forever. And when he does, let's hope it's the lever of the gas chamber, because that's where he belongs.
You've been listening to the John Talford Detroit Show with Dr. John Talford and co-host Charlotte Jones on WJZZ Detroit Internet Television, coming to you live every Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock. Also streaming on YouTube, Facebook, and